We are back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to move on to our next segment, sticking to the coaching theme of today's episode, and much like the first initial episodes are once we get more into the off season. This time going back to the Saints and their interest in Eagles' current offensive coordinator Kellen Moore. It's the week leading up to the Super Bowl now, and while other teams are moving forward already for next season in terms of getting their plans underway, the Saints still look to close out finding their new head coach, right? They still need to close out the initial step of it all, right? Unlike the Bears, who are already moving forward, the Patriots have been moving forward, right? They were the first team to get their head coach under consideration. They already got Mike Vrabel. The Jaguars are moving on, right? Everybody's got their guy, their leader, to lead them into this new era. Other than the Saints, they still remain the team without a head coach up until this point. But the fact that they still don't have one, I think, leads us to last week's discussion about them and their interest in Kellen Moore, right, the Eagles' offensive coordinator. And Tom Pelissero from NFL Media reported over the weekend that the Saints general manager, Mickey Loomis, informed other head coaching candidates that they plan on continuing discussions with Kellen Moore about this head coaching opportunity that they have. And although they can't talk with Kellen Moore directly and actually have those discussions right now or hire him until the end of the Super Bowl, their general manager has let everybody else know that we're planning on moving forward with Kellen Moore a little bit more once the opportunity comes up. So it's not to kind of make anything official, right, according to these reports, but just like as a warning, as a inclination as to which way this thing is going, right, and which way the Saints are sort of favoring as they try and look for a new head coach, right? The discussions we had last week about them meeting with Kellen Moore, flying out there, and mentioning also how, the longer I believe this is carried out, the more likely that it is going to be Kellen Moore, I believe, because the Saints have options, right? They have interviewed guys like Mike Kafka from the Giants, Anthony Weaver from the Miami Dolphins. They've interviewed twice with them already. So if they wanted to hire someone, I'm sure Mike Kafka or Anthony Weaver would love the opportunity to be the head coach. But the way the Saints are moving, according to this latest report, the longer this carries out, the more closer we get to it actually being Kellen Moore. And, to some people, to some concerns that the Saints head coaching job might not be the most sought after or be the worst one in some people's eyes. I mean, when you start talking about things like that and, people bringing up the reports that Joe Brady and Mike McCarthy pulled themselves out of consideration because they just didn't want the job, maybe because they thought that it wasn't a good opportunity at the end of the day, so they decided to retreat and say, you know what, no thanks, I've thought about it more, I'm actually not interested. Some people would link that to the fact that, the Saints head coaching job just isn't a very attractive one, quite honestly. So, there are those sides of the story, and I think it's a pretty valid point. But if Kellen Moore also didn't think that it was a good position or a good opportunity for him, then he would have already said, I'm actually not interested. I'm just going to stay in Philadelphia. He would have already let people know that, right? So I'm not really buying the idea that nobody wants this job or the Saints are not going to have anybody to go to. They're going to have their options, and I think the fact that, again, it's going longer and that we haven't heard any official news from the Saints or any further interviews since last they talked with Kellen Moore last week, I think that's a very positive sign for the Saints in getting the guy that they ultimately want in Kellen Moore, right? The more this stays quiet, the more you can assume that it's going to be Kellen Moore because they can't make the announcement already because they're not allowed to, right? It would be interfering with teams actually playing in the Super Bowl. So they actually can't make anything up right now. So after the reports and things like that, and we saw Mike McCarthy and Joe Brady pull out, we got the news about Kellen Moore and how he was the latest and most recent interview for the New Orleans Saints, and we just haven't heard anything else from that since then, right? The decision's not official or anything like that. The Saints and their general manager, what's his name, Mickey Loomis, haven't made any decision official yet. They're just letting all the candidates know that this is kind of where their heads are at, basically. So it is what it is now. That's sort of being floated out there. And, do I think this Saints job is a good one? I don't think it's the best one. I think all the best ones are already taken up, right? Obviously, but I wouldn't say it's like the worst one, because I think the Raiders one might be a little bit worse, just because you don't really know like where or what their plan is going to be, right? I feel like Pete Carroll and Chip Kelly, who we just finished talking about, are going to have a lot of a tougher time trying to figure out that team just in general and kind of turning the page into something that is a respectable, competitive project out there. I think the Saints have a little bit more of an advantage there, especially in a weaker division. Nobody talks about the fact that the Raiders are going to have to play potentially a 3-time Super Bowl champion in the Chiefs each year with Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes, obviously, Sean Payton, another legendary coach, and the job that he did in Denver. And then you also have Jim Harbaugh with the Chargers as an ascending team as well. That's also an aspect of this, right? The Saints are in a division with the Panthers, no offense, the Falcons, who didn't make the playoffs, and the Buccaneers, who also were in a tight division race as well with the Falcons. So this division is a lot more wide open, right? I think it could honestly be any of these 4 teams, right? The Panthers are probably the least favorite to win the division like this, but they showed some signs and they can give some people trouble. So this division is a lot more wide open. So that's why I also feel like this Saints job is not the worst, or it's just like a terrible job. There are certainly a lot of difficulties with it. If whether or not you like Derek Carr as your quarterback, or the fact that you only really have Chris Olave as one of the only real like bona fide weapons that you have on this team. Him and Alvin Kamara obviously are the main stages of this team, but then the offensive line could use some work. Other wide receivers other than just Chris Olave, right? You could make some improvements there as well. And then on the defensive side of the ball, it just feels like it's getting very much past their due date, right? It feels like they're a little bit older, a little bit more mature, almost just past their primes a little bit. So you gotta add some new players to kind of re-energize that group a little bit more, right? Get them to play like they did like 7 years ago or something like that, right? So they definitely have their own problems. They have their own things to kind of get over, but I don't think it's the worst job. I think the Raiders one, not the worst job, but it's the most difficult, I'd say, for the circumstances that I laid out. So with this, new development, there's also the possibility of Kellen Moore just deciding that he doesn't want it. What if after the Super Bowl, whether they win or lose, right, he kind of comes to a place where he decides, what, I kind of want to stay with the Eagles, right? Maybe this spot isn't for me. I'll stay with the Eagles one more season, and then we'll see where we're at in becoming a head coach. That's also a possibility, and I mean, if that were to happen, I'm sure the Eagles would be all right with going with Anthony Weaver or Mike Kafka. So, it wouldn't be the most ideal thing for the Saints to wait this long and then just go with their second or third option, but they have options, right? It's not like they're just going to have to go back to Darren Rizzi or something like that. I mean, they can. I think he's joining Sean Payton in Denver. So it's not as grave of a situation as it seems. I mean, the Saints also don't have a lot of cap space, so that makes it difficult. But overall, I think if Kellen Moore does end up getting this job like it looks like he is going to, I think this would be a pretty exciting opportunity for him, because, I mean, there's not a lot of expectations, right? To come and be the head coach of a team with not a lot of expectations, not a lot of pressure, and get to coach guys like Chris Olave, Alvin Kamara, Cameron Jordan, and have a high draft pick as well. I think that's one of the the most low maintenance, low expectation sort of situation that you could find nowadays in the NFL, right? Because the Bears are expected to get a lot better, right? And compete for that division. The Jaguars are also expected to play a lot better, and they're expected to turn Trevor Lawrence around rather quickly. The Jets is another one. In that market, everybody wants the results tomorrow. They want it immediately. So that's a lot more pressure that a new head coach is going to have to deal with, right? So I think barring that and, putting it into its proper context, I don't think this is a situation where Kellen Moore looks at it and thinks, you know what, like why would I want that job? I think this could be a very low risk kind of opportunity for Kellen Moore. And also I think it's important that the Saints acknowledge where they're at right now. They're not winning the Super Bowl, and they're probably not making the playoffs next season. But they got to acknowledge that and really think about this long term. Like, we got to give Kellen Moore some time and give him the resources to really build this team up, right? Not have such a short term, immediate sort of, success kind of mindset, right? This is a long term thing. And the more they accept that, the more they give Kellen Moore time. I am pretty confident that he could turn this situation around. It's not as grave as everybody thinks it is. So once the news becomes official or not, we'll know a lot more probably around this time next week, next Monday or next Tuesday, whether Kellen Moore will be or will not be the head coach of the Saints. So by the time that comes around, we'll have moved on, much like we are on today's show with the last couple segments here. We're going to go back to the series we started last week, talking about the positions that I feel like some teams need to improve on in 2025. We already talked about the Packers and some spots I believe they need to upgrade at. Now we're going to stay in that division and move over to the Chicago Bears. Where do they need to make their biggest improvements? We'll answer that when we return after this break.